They say some lights are never meant to shine again. But on a cold October night along the rocky coast of Maine, a lighthouse that had stood dark for 57 years suddenly awakened. No one lived there. No one maintained it. The narrow tower rose above the cliffs like a forgotten monument, its cracked windows staring out across the Atlantic while fog drifted over the water in slow, ghost-like ribbons. Yet just after midnight, a beam of pale gold light swept across the ocean. Once, then again. The fishermen in town noticed it first. By sunrise, everyone was talking about it. Some called it a trick of the weather. Others whispered about old legends buried beneath the salt and stone. But miles away, a homeless veteran named Ethan Mercer was driving north with his loyal German shepherd beside him, unaware that his life was about to change forever. Ranger sat upright in the passenger seat, ears alert, amber eyes fixed on the horizon. As the truck rounded a bend overlooking the sea, the dog suddenly stiffened. A low sound rolled from his chest. Not fear, not warning, but recognition. Far ahead, through the morning mist, the broken lighthouse stood against the gray sky. And for the first time in decades, its light was still burning. Ethan Mercer had not planned to stop in the town of Gray Harbor. He had been following the coastline for weeks, sleeping wherever he could park his aging pickup truck and picking up small repair jobs whenever luck allowed. At 40 years old, he carried himself with the quiet endurance of a man who had learned long ago that life rarely followed the map you drew for it. His dark brown hair showed faint streaks of silver near the temples, and his weathered canvas jacket smelled faintly of cedar dust, engine oil, and ocean air. Beside him, Ranger watched the world pass through the windshield with unwavering focus. The German shepherd had been his companion for 6 years, through empty highways, harsh winters, and long stretches of uncertainty. They reached Gray Harbor shortly after sunrise. The town rested between steep cliffs and the Atlantic Ocean, a place where fishing boats still rocked gently in the harbor and weathered storefronts. Carried the charm of another era. Yet there was something unusual in the atmosphere that morning. Small groups of people stood outside the diner and bait shop, speaking in hushed voices while glancing toward the distant shoreline. Ethan followed their gaze and saw the stone tower standing alone against the sea. Even from several miles away, it seemed to command attention. Ranger pressed his nose against the passenger window. His ears lifted. His body grew still. Ethan noticed the change immediately. The dog was not excited. He was listening. They parked beside a small marina where gulls circled overhead and ropes tapped rhythmically against wooden docks. An elderly fisherman sat on a bench repairing a net. His hands paused when he noticed Ethan looking toward the cliffs. "You heading up there?" the old man asked. Ethan shrugged. "Maybe." The fisherman studied him for a moment before shaking his head slowly. "Most folks stay away from that place." Ethan smiled faintly. "Why?" The old man folded his net. "Because strange things happen around it." Ethan had heard similar stories his entire life. Abandoned houses, forgotten farms, deserted churches. Every town seemed to have one place people preferred not to explain. Usually the truth turned out to be far simpler than the rumors. Yet Ranger remained unusually focused on the distant tower. His amber eyes never left it. By late morning, Ethan found the county office. The building smelled of old paper and coffee. After a brief conversation with a clerk, he learned something surprising. The lighthouse property had been sitting and used for decades. No investors wanted it. No developers wanted it. Maintaining the structure would cost more than it appeared to be worth. The county had reduced the acquisition fee again and again until almost nobody paid attention anymore. Ethan stared at the paperwork. The price was less than what many people spent on a weekend vacation. The clerk laughed softly when she saw his expression. "Trust me," she said. "If there was anything valuable up there, somebody would have found it by now." Ethan looked down at Ranger lying quietly beside the chair. The dog suddenly lifted his head and stared toward the window facing the ocean. Outside, far beyond the harbor, the distant tower stood beneath the pale autumn sky. For a brief second, Ethan thought he saw a flash of light glimmer from one of its upper windows. Then it vanished. Ranger rose to his feet, and without making a sound, he walked toward the door. Ranger did not wait for Ethan to call him. The German shepherd pushed through the office door and stepped into the cool afternoon air as though he had already made a decision. Ethan thanked the clerk, folded the paperwork beneath his arm, and followed. A steady breeze rolled in from the Atlantic, carrying the scent of salt, seaweed, and distant rain. Above the harbor, clouds drifted across the pale blue sky like slow-moving ships. Most people would have spent the afternoon finding a motel or a hot meal. Ethan found himself driving toward the cliffs instead. The narrow coastal road wound through patches of pine and weathered stone walls until the town disappeared behind him. Ranger sat unusually still during the drive. His ears remained forward, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The closer they came to the shoreline, the quieter he became. Nearly an hour later, Ethan parked beside a rusted gate overlooking the ocean. Beyond it stretched a gravel path leading toward the old structure. Tall grass swayed in the wind. Wildflowers pushed through cracks in the earth. Everything seemed forgotten, untouched by time. He stepped out of the truck and listened. Waves crashed far below against black rocks hidden beneath white foam. Seagulls circled overhead, their cries carried away by the wind. Yet beneath those familiar sounds was something else. Something faint. Something difficult to identify. Ranger heard it immediately. The dog froze. His head tilted slightly. Then he began walking forward with slow, deliberate steps. Ethan followed the path until the tower rose before them. Up close, the years showed everywhere. Salt had stained the stone walls. Several windows were boarded shut. Rust covered the iron railings that spiraled toward the lantern room above. Yet despite the decay, the place felt strangely alive. Not haunted, not threatening, simply waiting. The heavy front door groaned as Ethan pushed it open. Cool air drifted out to meet them. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight that slipped between cracks in the boards. Ranger entered first. His nails clicked softly against the stone floor. Ethan switched on a flashlight and swept its beam across the interior. The circular chamber was mostly empty. Old equipment sat beneath canvas covers. Wooden shelves leaned against the walls. Everything carried the scent of age and salt. Ranger moved slowly around the room, sniffing corners, studying the floor, pausing every few feet as though listening to something hidden beneath the stone. Then he stopped. The dog stood perfectly still near the base of the spiral staircase. His ears lifted. A low sound rolled from his chest. Ethan crossed the room and knelt beside him. At first he heard nothing. Only distant waves and the whistle of wind through old cracks. Then it came. Tap. A faint metallic sound. Ethan looked around. Silence returned. Several seconds passed. Tap. The noise echoed again. Soft. Precise. Almost rhythmic. Ranger pressed one paw against the floor and stared directly at the center of the room. Ethan shined his flashlight downward. The stone surface appeared ordinary except for one thing. Near the edge of the staircase, a section of floor showed a slightly different color than the surrounding rock. Weather and time had hidden it well, but now that he noticed it, the difference seemed impossible to ignore. Before he could investigate further, another sound drifted down from above. Not from below this time. From somewhere high inside the tower. A faint metallic chime. Ranger immediately lifted his head toward the staircase. His tail lowered. His amber eyes widened with intense focus. Then, without hesitation, he started climbing. Ranger climbed the spiral staircase with a sense of purpose that Ethan had learned never to ignore. The narrow iron steps curved upward through the center of the tower, disappearing into shadows above. Dust stirred beneath their feet while the distant sound of waves echoed through the stone walls like a slow heartbeat. The metallic chime came again. Soft, delicate, almost impossible to hear. Yet the dog moved faster. By the time Ethan reached the upper level, Ranger was already standing outside a weathered wooden door near the lantern room. The German shepherd sat down and stared directly at it. The door looked ordinary enough, faded by decades of salt air and neglect. A rusted brass handle hung loosely from one side. Yet something about it felt different. Ethan pushed it open carefully. The hinges released a long groan. A small room appeared beyond. Unlike the rest of the tower, this space seemed untouched. Dust covered everything, but the room itself remained strangely preserved. A narrow desk stood beneath a window overlooking the ocean. Shelves lined the walls. A brass oil lamp rested beside stacks of yellowed notebooks. The air carried the scent of old paper and cedar wood. Ethan stepped inside slowly. Ranger followed, his ears still alert. The room felt less like storage and more like someone had simply walked away and never returned. On the desk sat a framed photograph. Ethan lifted it carefully. The image showed a lighthouse keeper standing beside a woman and a young boy. All three were smiling into the camera. The photograph had faded with time, but their faces still carried warmth. Behind the frame lay a leather-bound journal. Ethan opened it. The pages crackled softly beneath his fingers. Most entries contained weather observations, shipping notes, and maintenance records. Day after day, year after year. Yet as he turned deeper into the journal, the writing began to change. The entries grew shorter, more personal, more uncertain. One passage caught his attention immediately. The sea keeps sending the signal. I do not understand why. Another entry appeared several weeks later. If anyone finds this, follow the sound, not the light. Ethan frowned. Ranger suddenly moved toward a shelf in the corner. The dog pressed his nose against the wood and whined softly. Ethan set down the journal and crossed the room. Several books sat stacked against the wall. Maritime histories, navigation manuals, tide charts. Nothing unusual. Yet Ranger remained focused. Ethan removed the books one by one until only the shelf remained. That was when he noticed faint scratch marks near the back panel. Someone had opened it before. Carefully. Repeatedly. His pulse quickened. He ran his hand along the edge of the wood. A hidden latch clicked beneath his fingers. The entire panel shifted inward by several inches. Behind it sat a narrow compartment, hidden from view. Inside rested a rolled map, tied with a faded blue ribbon, and a sealed envelope covered in dust. Ethan stared for a moment before opening the letter. The handwriting was steady despite its age. To the one who finally hears what others ignored. Do not trust appearances. The tower only guards the truth. The answer lies beneath. Ethan read the line twice. Beneath. The word echoed through his thoughts. Below the tower. Below the stone floor. Below the place where Ranger had first stopped. A gust of wind suddenly swept through the room. Somewhere below, faint and distant, came the metallic tapping again. This time it sounded closer than before. The sun was already sinking toward the horizon when Ethan and Ranger returned to the ground floor. Golden light spilled through the narrow windows, painting long shadows across the stone floor. The ocean beyond the cliffs glowed with streaks of amber and silver, but inside the tower, the air felt cooler now. He could not stop thinking about the letter. The answer lies beneath. Those 4 words lingered in his mind with every step. Ranger wasted no time. The German shepherd returned directly to the section of floor near the base of the spiral staircase. He sniffed the stone carefully, then scratched once against the same spot he had focused on earlier. Ethan crouched beside him and examined the surface again. Now that he knew what to look for, the difference was unmistakable. One circular section of stone had been fitted more precisely than the surrounding floor. The edges were nearly invisible, concealed beneath decades of dust and wear, but they were there. Someone had hidden this intentionally. Ethan retrieved a pry bar from his truck and spent nearly an hour working around the edges. The stone refused to move. Whoever built it had expected it to remain closed. Outside, the wind strengthened. Clouds gathered over the ocean, turning the horizon dark blue. A storm was approaching. The first distant rumble rolled across the water. Ranger suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood high. He was listening again. Then came the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. 3 steady knocks from somewhere below. Ethan froze. The sound seemed clearer now. Not louder, but closer. As though whatever had been hidden beneath the tower had begun responding to their presence. The storm arrived faster than expected. Rain swept across the cliffs in silver curtains. Wind howled through cracks in the stone walls. Waves crashed against the shoreline below with enough force to shake the ground. Ethan secured the windows as best he could and lit several lanterns he had found upstairs. Their warm glow filled the room with dancing shadows. Ranger refused to leave the circular stone. He lay beside it, alert and watchful. Hours passed. Near midnight, the storm reached its peak. Rain hammered the tower. The old structure groaned under the pressure of wind and weather. Then something unexpected happened. A tremendous wave struck the cliffside below. The entire tower trembled. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Ethan steadied himself against the wall. Another wave crashed moments later. A sharp cracking sound echoed beneath the floor. Ranger leaped to his feet. Ethan swung his lantern toward the circular stone just as a thin line appeared across its surface. Water had not caused the crack. Age had. Decades of pressure. Decades of storms. and now nature itself seemed determined to reveal what had been hidden. Ethan dropped to one knee and pressed the pry bar into the opening. This time the stone shifted. Only slightly. But it moved. His pulse quickened. He pushed harder. Slowly, inch by inch, the heavy section began to rise. A rush of cold air escaped from below. Air that smelled not of the sea, but of dry stone untouched for generations. Ranger stepped forward immediately. The dog stared into the darkness with intense focus. Ethan lifted the lantern higher. Beneath the floor, a narrow staircase descended into blackness. Ancient stone steps disappeared into the earth below the cliffs. Rain battered the tower overhead. Wind screamed around the walls. Yet down there, beneath everything, only silence waited. Ranger looked back at Ethan once. Then he took the first step downward. Ranger descended carefully into the darkness, his paws silent against the ancient stone steps. Ethan followed close behind, lantern raised high above his head. The staircase spiraled deep beneath the cliffs, far below the reach of wind and rain. With every step, the sounds of the storm faded until only a distant murmur remained. The air grew cooler, drier, older. It carried the faint scent of stone, cedar, and something else Ethan could not immediately identify. Something preserved, something untouched. The lantern light revealed walls carved directly into bedrock. Whoever had built this passage had done so with extraordinary skill. The staircase continued for nearly 50 feet before finally opening into a vast underground chamber. Ethan stopped. For a moment, he simply stared. The room stretched far beyond the reach of his lantern. Massive stone columns supported the ceiling overhead. Wooden beams, darkened with age but still intact, crossed portions of the cavern. It did not look like a hidden cave. It looked like an underground facility. Ranger moved ahead slowly, his ears alert. The German shepherd seemed fascinated rather than frightened. Ethan swept the lantern across the chamber and discovered row after row of sealed wooden crates. Hundreds of them, some stacked neatly against the walls. Others arranged in long corridors disappearing into shadow. Every crate bore faded markings that time had nearly erased. Near the center of the room stood a large brass mechanism connected to pipes that disappeared into the stone ceiling. Ethan approached cautiously. The metal surface remained polished despite its age. That was impossible. Nothing survived decades underground in such condition without maintenance. Then he noticed something extraordinary. The mechanism was still operating. Very slowly, very quietly. A small pendulum moved back and forth. Tick, tick, tick. The metallic tapping that had echoed through the tower. Ethan felt a chill travel through his spine. Someone had built a machine designed to run for generations. Ranger circled the device before stopping beside a long wooden table. Papers lay scattered across its surface beneath a thick layer of dust. Ethan brushed one clean. It was not a map. It was an engineering blueprint. Then another. Then another. Detailed drawings covered the table. Coastal structures. Harbor systems. Maritime inventions. Designs unlike anything Ethan had seen before. In one corner appeared a familiar signature repeated again and again. Jonathan Hale, the lighthouse keeper from the journal. Ethan continued examining the documents. The deeper he looked, the more astonishing they became. These were not random sketches. They were original designs. Patents. Research notes. Innovations decades ahead of their time. Some had never been published. Some had never been built. Yet all of them remained preserved here beneath the cliffs. Ranger suddenly stopped moving. His gaze fixed on a steel door positioned at the far end of the cavern. Unlike everything else, it appeared almost untouched by age. The dog walked toward it slowly and sat down. Ethan followed. Above the door, engraved into the metal, were 7 simple words. For the one who chose kindness first. Ethan stared at the inscription while the pendulum continued its steady rhythm behind him. Tick, tick, tick. Then somewhere beyond the steel door, he heard another sound. Not machinery, not the ocean. A faint mechanical hum awakening after decades of silence. The faint hum beyond the steel door seemed to pulse through the stone itself. Ethan stood motionless for several seconds, lantern raised, while Ranger remained seated beside the entrance. The dog was not barking. He was not growling. He simply watched, as though he had finally reached the place that had been calling to him since they arrived. The inscription above the doorway lingered in Ethan's thoughts. For the one who chose kindness first. It did not sound like a warning. It sounded like a test that had already been completed. He searched the frame carefully and soon discovered a concealed lever hidden within the stonework. The metal resisted at first, then released with a deep mechanical click. Somewhere inside the chamber, gears began to move. Dust drifted from the ceiling as the massive door slowly opened inward. A warm glow spilled into the cavern. Ethan shielded his eyes. For the first time since entering the underground complex, he saw evidence that this place had once been extraordinary. The room beyond looked less like a vault and more like a private museum. Glass display cases lined the walls. Shelves held carefully preserved journals, prototypes, instruments, and intricate mechanical models. Copper and brass reflected the lantern light with a soft golden sheen. Everything had been arranged with remarkable care. At the center stood a large table illuminated by an unusual lamp powered by the system still humming beneath the floor. Ethan approached slowly. On the table rested dozens of leather folders sealed inside protective cases. He opened one and immediately realized what he was holding. Patent registrations, legal ownership records, original engineering designs. Many carried official stamps dating back more than 60 years. As he continued reading, the truth gradually emerged. Jonathan Hale had not merely been a lighthouse keeper. He had been an inventor, a brilliant one. His innovations had transformed shipping safety, harbor construction, navigation systems, and coastal engineering. Yet for reasons Ethan did not yet understand, many of his greatest discoveries had never been submitted publicly. They had remained hidden, preserved, waiting. Ranger wandered quietly through the room before stopping beside a large wall map of the Atlantic coast. Ethan followed and noticed dozens of handwritten notes attached around various ports and cities. Some inventions had eventually been recreated by others decades later. Some had become foundations for industries worth millions. The value of the preserved patents alone would be enormous, far greater than any forgotten treasure chest filled with gold. Ethan felt overwhelmed. This was not a secret worth thousands. It was worth millions, perhaps much more. Yet as he continued examining the documents, another detail captured his attention. Every folder contained the same instruction. If these records are ever discovered, ownership shall pass to the individual who restores the light and preserves the purpose. Ethan stared at the sentence. Ownership. The legal language appeared precise and enforceable. Jonathan Hale had anticipated this moment. He had built the underground facility. He had protected his life's work. And somehow he had created a path for the future. Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the far corner of the room. There, partially hidden behind a cabinet, stood a final wooden chest. Unlike everything else, it carried no labels. No markings. Only a small brass plaque. Ethan brushed away the dust and read the inscription. The greatest secret was never the invention. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he opened the chest. Inside rested a single journal wrapped carefully in oilcloth. The final journal. The last message Jonathan Hale had left behind. And judging by the date written across the cover, it had been sealed only weeks before he disappeared forever. The journal felt heavier than it should have. Ethan carried it to the illuminated table and carefully untied the oilcloth protecting its cover. Ranger settled beside him, watching quietly while the distant hum of the underground machinery continued its steady rhythm. Outside, somewhere beyond layers of stone and earth, the storm still moved across the coastline. Down here, time seemed suspended. Ethan opened the first page. The handwriting was identical to the entries he had found upstairs, but the tone was different. More personal. More urgent. Jonathan Hale was not writing to record weather conditions or maintain records. He was writing to explain why he had hidden everything. Page after page revealed the truth. Decades earlier, several powerful companies had attempted to purchase his inventions. Some offered enormous sums of money. Others promised recognition and influence. Yet Jonathan repeatedly refused. His greatest designs had never been intended to make a single person wealthy. They had been created to improve safety along dangerous coastlines, protect fishing communities, and save lives at sea. As Ethan continued reading, a deeper reason emerged. Jonathan had discovered that many people cared more about profit than purpose. Rather than allow his work to disappear into private ownership, he withdrew from public life and concealed everything beneath the cliffs. He built the underground facility himself over many years, using trusted craftsmen who never knew the full scope of the project. Then Ethan reached the final section of the journal. The pages became increasingly reflective. Jonathan wrote about growing older, about losing family, about watching storms pass from the lantern room while wondering whether anyone would ever understand why he had chosen this path. One passage stopped Ethan cold. Wealth is not what survives us. Character is. If you are reading this, then you did not find this place because you were searching for treasure. You found it because you chose something else first. Ethan sat silently for several moments. The words felt strangely personal. Jonathan could not have known him. Yet somehow the message seemed directed toward him specifically. Ranger rested his head against Ethan's knee. The simple gesture brought an unexpected warmth. Ethan turned to the final pages. There he discovered the greatest revelation of all. The patents, designs, and ownership rights were indeed worth millions. But Jonathan had never intended them to belong to a private collector or corporation. Legal documents attached to the journal established a charitable trust. Whoever discovered the hidden archive would become its steward, responsible for preserving the inventions and using their value to support coastal communities, historical preservation, maritime education, and public safety projects. Ethan read the documents twice. Then a third time. Everything appeared legitimate, carefully prepared, enforceable. The hidden fortune was real, but it came with a purpose larger than money. Suddenly the entire story made sense. The inscription above the steel door, the preserved facility, the instructions left behind. Jonathan had not been hiding wealth. He had been protecting a legacy until the right person arrived. Ranger suddenly stood and walked toward a narrow window cut into the stone wall. Ethan followed. Beyond the thick glass, he could see the dark Atlantic far below, illuminated by flashes of distant lightning. Then something remarkable happened. The underground system seemed to respond to the storm overhead. Lights throughout the chamber brightened one by one. Brass instruments began to glow softly. And deep within the walls, ancient machinery awakened fully for the first time in decades, revealing one final secret Jonathan Hale had left waiting in the darkness. The ancient machinery continued to awaken throughout the underground complex, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Soft golden light spread through chambers that had remained hidden from the world for generations. Brass gears turned with quiet precision. Mechanical indicators shifted gently behind glass panels. The entire facility seemed less like a forgotten vault and more like a living testament to one man's vision. Ethan stood beside Ranger and watched in silence. Then he noticed a final corridor illuminated at the far end of the chamber. It had been completely dark before. Now a row of lights guided the way forward. Ranger moved first. The German shepherd walked calmly through the corridor, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. Ethan followed. At the end of the passage stood a circular room unlike anything else underground. Tall windows faced the ocean through carefully engineered shafts carved into the cliffs. Dawn was beginning to break outside. Pale blue light filtered through the glass and mingled with the warm glow of the restored machinery. In the center of the room stood a scale model of the coastline. Every harbor, lighthouse, fishing village, and shipping channel had been recreated with astonishing detail. Around the model were dozens of plaques describing projects Jonathan Hale had quietly funded throughout his lifetime. Schools, rescue stations, navigation systems, community harbors. The inventions had always been only part of the story. The real purpose had been helping people. Ethan slowly understood what Jonathan had wanted preserved. Not wealth, not recognition, service. A final envelope rested beside the model. Ethan opened it carefully. Inside was a short letter written in the same familiar hand. If you are standing here, then the light has chosen to shine again. The inventions may carry value. The patents may create wealth. But neither is the true inheritance. The true inheritance is the chance to leave a place better than you found it. Ethan lowered the letter. For a long moment, he simply stared at the ocean beyond the windows. The first rays of sunrise stretched across the Atlantic like ribbons of gold. Ranger sat quietly beside him. The dog seemed completely at peace. Weeks later, the story spread far beyond Gray Harbor. Historians arrived. Engineers arrived. Legal experts confirmed the authenticity of the archive. The trust Jonathan Hale created was established exactly as he intended. The preserved patents generated resources worth millions. Restoration projects began along the coast. Scholarships were funded. Maritime museums were expanded. Fishing communities received support. Yet the change most people noticed happened on the cliffs themselves. The tower overlooking the ocean was restored with extraordinary care. Its stone walls were repaired. Its lantern room was rebuilt. Its light once again swept across the sea each night. Visitors traveled from across the country to see it. Children listened to stories about the inventor who protected his legacy beneath the earth and the veteran who discovered it decades later. Ethan never sought attention. He remained exactly who he had always been. Quiet, humble, steady. He accepted responsibility for the trust and devoted himself to preserving its mission. As for Ranger, he became something of a local legend. Tourists often smiled when they saw the silver-gray shepherd resting near the entrance, watching the horizon with those alert amber eyes. One evening nearly a year later, Ethan stood outside as the lighthouse beam turned slowly across the darkening ocean. The wind carried the scent of salt and pine. Waves rolled against the rocks below. Ranger settled beside him, calm and content. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt something he thought he had lost forever. Not success, not fortune, belonging. The tower no longer stood abandoned. The hidden legacy no longer waited in darkness. And the man who arrived with nowhere left to go had finally found a place to call home.